Imagine walking through the streets of an ancient city full of temples dedicated to various gods and statues of divinized emperors. In this setting, a newborn faith, based on the teachings of a humble teacher from Judea, faced the distrust of a powerful empire. During the first centuries of Christianity, thousands of men and women risked everything by refusing to worship other gods, upholding the commitment to follow only one God and one Savior. Thus emerged one of the most remarkable chapters in history, the long period of persecution faced by Christians in the Roman Empire, from the early days after the death of Jesus Christ to the moment when the faith emerged triumphant and respected, sealing irreversible changes in the heart of Rome. Before we dive into this fascinating story, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss out on our content full of curiosities and reflections on the Roman Empire. Hold on tight, because next we'll learn about the first tensions between the followers of Jesus Christ and the Roman world, an environment in which faith, initially discreet, would come to be observed with great caution. The beginning of faith in hostile territory. In the years following the death of Jesus Christ, the small Christian community found an immense cultural and religious stage in the Roman Empire. The first followers of Jesus Christ were seen as an offshoot of Judaism, and this initial proximity to Jewish communities made Christianity almost invisible to the Roman authorities. However, before long, the difference in Christian beliefs and customs, especially the refusal to participate in religious ceremonies that included the worship of the emperor and the official gods, began to attract attention. The oral communication between the first Christians and their zeal for transmitting teachings of respect, charity, and fidelity to a single God made them peculiar in the face of Roman polytheism. For not offering sacrifices to the gods of the state, many Christians came to be labeled as enemies of public order, since religion in that context was also a structure of power and politics. If you admire the courage of these early Christians, leave your like now. This simple gesture helps us to continue bringing you profound and inspiring historical content. The subtle tension that began to form under Tiberius's rule was not yet open persecution, but it laid the foundations for what was to come, a conflict between faith centered on Jesus Christ and an empire that demanded devotion to its own deities. Now get ready to move forward in time and see how, in the era of Emperor Tiberius, the Christian faith began to be viewed with increasing suspicion, albeit in a moderate way. Tiberius and the first glance. Under Emperor Tiberius, Christians were still a relatively unknown group, but the differentiation between traditional Jewish practices and the Christian message was already beginning to emerge. Although there was no systematic policy against the followers of Christ, certain regional tensions were emerging. Jews and Christians differed on central points, and the authorities observed with curiosity and caution the new faith that did not pay homage to the emperor as if he were a god. In some cases, this mistrust resulted in specific measures to contain the growth of ideas that seemed foreign to Roman custom. The fact that Christians didn't celebrate state religious festivals or offer libations to traditional deities sounded like an act of disloyalty. Did you know that this initial atmosphere of suspicion was crucial in shaping Rome's perception of Christians in the future? Let us know in the comments if you thought the tensions began so subtly. As time progressed, the Christian faith would come face to face with different imperial figures, some indifferent, others hostile, and others even more obstinate in imposing the imperial cult at all costs. Next, we will enter the reign of Caligula, an emperor whose volatile temperament and demand for personal worship would amplify tensions and test the limits of the patience of the Christian and Jewish communities. Caligula, the cult of personality that defied faith. Caligula, known for his extravagant and authoritarian personality, took the cult of the imperial figure to a new level. He expected to be treated as a deity in his lifetime, something that sounded unacceptable to monotheistic groups. Jews and Christians, both uncompromising about the exclusive worship of their God, naturally became targets of scrutiny, even if the actions against them were not as extensive as they would become in the future. The pressure to participate in rituals that honored the emperor was direct. Refusing to celebrate the ruler as a divine being was almost like declaring opposition to the state. This attitude created an atmosphere of growing hostility. The Christian faith, still fragile, found itself in a delicate position. Either it maintained its integrity and risked punishment, or it gave in to the dominant cultural pressure. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to live under the rule of a leader who demands personal worship? Let us know what you think in the comments. Caligula's rule foreshadowed even worse times. Soon, the time would come when suspicion and intolerance would turn into brutal acts, marking historical memory forever. Next, we'll see how Emperor Claudius changed the scenario by stepping up measures against groups considered to be troublesome, resulting in the first large-scale displacement of Christians in Rome. Claudius and the First Great Expulsion. With Claudius, the situation of the Christians took a leap towards more obvious repression. The expulsion of Jews from Rome, including many Christians, showed that imperial patience was limited in the face of groups whose loyalty to the state cult was questionable. Thus, the followers of Jesus Christ were forced to leave the capital of the empire, spreading to other regions and taking the Christian message to more places, including the eastern and western Mediterranean. This involuntary movement ended up serving the expansion of Christianity, a paradoxical effect. What was thought of as punishment became a vector for spreading the faith. In addition, influential figures in the Christian community suffered at this time, including apostles and respected leaders, reinforcing a sense of martyrdom and spiritual commitment. Can you imagine how the forced dispersion impacted the formation of the first congregations outside Rome? Leave a like if you think this adversity strengthened belief rather than weakened it. Claudius's repression prepared the ground for harsher rulers, culminating in an era of open violence against Christians that would become sadly famous in posterity. Next, we will learn about the most remembered milestone in the memory of the persecutions, the reign of Nero and the Great Fire of Rome, an episode that ignited the flames of cruelty against Christians. Nero, the beginning of the flames. The year 64 AD brought the tragedy of the Great Fire of Rome, which consumed entire neighborhoods. Nero, in order to distance himself from popular suspicions that he might have caused the disaster, found a perfect scapegoat in the Christians. The result was a violent and indiscriminate persecution. Christians were arrested, tortured, and publicly executed, serving as a cruel spectacle and warning to anyone who dared to disrespect the emperor. During this period, some of the central figures of Christianity were martyred, strengthening the sacredness of the faith. It is said that Peter and Paul, key apostles in spreading the gospel, lost their lives during this terrible phase. Their names became symbols of spiritual resistance in the face of state brutality. Do you admire the courage of these martyrs? Leave your like now, because it motivates us to keep bringing you stories that inspire us to reflect on courage and faith. From that point on, the stage was set. The persecution would go through ups and downs, depending on the temperament and political interests of each emperor, but it would leave deep marks on the Christian soul. Next, we'll see how, after Nero's death, a period of instability opened gaps for a relative decrease in persecution, especially under Vespasian and Titus. Brief relief and the arrival of Vespasian. The fall of Nero plunged the empire into a brief chaos known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In this context, Rome's priority was not to hunt down Christians, but to re-establish internal order. When Vespasian took the throne, the focus turned to military issues, reconstruction, and economic stability. Although Christianity remained illegal and was viewed with suspicion, there was no longer the same persecutory impetus that had inflamed the previous years. With Titus, the main concern followed the same pattern: logistics, defense of the borders, and the recovery of the empire's prestige. During this interlude, even without explicit tolerance policies, the intensity of the persecutions decreased considerably. It was a time when Christians could breathe a little, reorganize their communities, and, at the same time, begin to spread more freely throughout the vast Roman territory. This period shows that persecution was neither constant nor uniform. Have you ever thought about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. However, the calm would not be permanent. Soon, a new emperor would bring back the shadow of intolerance, reminding everyone that the freedom of Christians was far from guaranteed. We now enter the reign of Domitian, an authoritarian ruler who rekindled the flames of persecution, becoming a new nightmare for Christians. Domitian, the return of intolerance. Domitian was a suspicious and rigid emperor who sought to reaffirm his authority through the imperial cult. His attitude contributed to the resurgence of systematic persecution against Christians. Prominent leaders of the faith became targets, and the simple refusal to participate in official rituals was reason enough for severe punishment. During Domitian's rule, the idea grew that Christians not only refused to worship the emperor, but also destabilized the foundations of the empire. The exile of John, one of Jesus Christ's closest disciples, to the island of Patmos exemplifies the strategy of removing spiritual leaders from their communities in an attempt to weaken the Christian structure. It's impressive how the faith has survived, even in the midst of these cruel strategies, don't you think? Leave a like if you admire the resilience of these Christians who continued to spread their message despite all the obstacles. History, however, moved on, and after Domitian came new emperors with different approaches, sometimes milder, sometimes equally severe. Next, we will enter the period of Trajan, who formalized a clear legal stance towards Christianity, becoming a benchmark for how the authorities would deal with Christ's faithful. Trajan and the test of faith. Trajan, renowned for expanding and organizing the empire, also left his name in the history of Christian persecution. Under his rule, a clear policy was established. Being a Christian was punishable if you refused to take part in official rituals. This period is famous for the correspondence between the emperor and Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, who sought advice on how to deal with denounced Christians. Trajan's response made the criteria clear: those who denied their faith by offering sacrifices to the Roman gods and the emperor would be released. Those who persisted in their Christian faith would be punished and could even be executed. It was a method that tested not only beliefs, but the very moral fiber of the faithful. Do you believe that this test of fidelity to the empire provoked intense personal dilemmas? Let us know in the comments what you think about these psychological and spiritual challenges. Trajan's strategy was not to create martyrs in droves, but to force Christians to choose between their faith and life, making the act of remaining a Christian a sign of deep conviction. Next, we'll look at Hadrian's period, marked by a slight change in tone, a certain moderation that altered the relationship between the state and the Christian communities. Hadriano, a brief light in the dark. With Hadrian, the approach became a little more balanced. Although Christianity remained without legal recognition, merely being a Christian was no longer automatic grounds for punishment. Accusations without proof had to be rejected, which reduced the impetus for persecutions based on rumors or slander. This meant that the imperial power was more concerned with concrete acts against order than with simple religious identification. Christianity momentarily ceased to be a constant target, acquiring a certain space in which to structure itself. This period, although not one of total peace, indicated a small change. The state's concern was to contain instability, not necessarily to persecute those who had a different faith. Tell us in the comments, do you think that Hadrian's more reasonable stance paved the way for future tolerance of Christianity? However, the tranquility would not last forever. Subsequent governments would bring back the cycle of persecutions, driven either by local pressures or by the imperial conviction to impose the state cult. Next, we will enter the reign of Marcus Aurelius, one of the emperors most admired for his Stoic philosophy, but under whose rule local persecutions of Christians would once again increase. Marcus Aurelius and the popular persecutions. Marcus Aurelius, often remembered for his work Meditations and for his philosophical serenity, faced turbulence in various regions of the empire. The persecutions of Christians in this period were often spurred on by local pressures. Angry populations and unfounded rumors created a moral panic, accusing Christians of terrible practices such as cannibalism and incest. Unfounded accusations, but which frightened the people. In some towns, the popular mob against Christianity was so intense that it forced the authorities to intervene, resulting in arrests, torture, and executions. Community leaders were tested, trying to force them to renounce their faith in order to save order. This scenario demonstrates the complex interaction between central power, pressure from the masses, and the unwavering faith of Christ's followers. Leave a like if you're surprised by the pressure coming not only from those in power, but also from the masses. Marcus Aurelius's stance on these events is not entirely clear, but the fact is that under his rule, the persecutions did not disappear, proving that the road to Christianity would still be long and arduous. Next, we will see the reign of Decius, who intensified the oppression once again, this time in a systematic way, testing the inner strength of every Christian. Decius, the height of cruelty. Decius promoted a harsh policy. All the inhabitants of the empire, except the Jews, had to sacrifice to the Roman gods and prove their loyalty to the state by obtaining an official certificate. Refusal meant torture, imprisonment, or death. This massive demand placed every Christian in a radical dilemma. Many preferred to suffer and die rather than deny their faith, becoming martyrs whose example would strengthen the Christian community. This was one of the most far-reaching persecutions to date, generating internal divisions between those who resisted and those who, in the face of fear, gave in to save their lives. The trauma caused by Decius would be remembered for decades, marking a critical point in the relationship between Rome and the Church. Have you ever thought about what you would do in this situation? Write in the comments if you think you would keep your faith in the face of such pressure. The intensity of the persecution wouldn't last forever, but it would leave deep scars on future generations of Christians. Next, we'll move on to the reign of Valerian, who concentrated his efforts on eliminating Christian leadership, believing that this would weaken the community as a whole. Valerian and the clergy. Valerian understood that the strength of Christianity lay in its leadership, in the bishops, deacons, and priests who led the communities. By targeting them, he hoped to disrupt the Christian organization. So decrees were issued ordering these key figures to either submit to the imperial cult or face death and the confiscation of their property. This method was cruel, but paradoxically it gave the martyred leaders more notoriety, making them symbols of faith and courage. Over time, these martyrs did not weaken Christianity, but strengthened it. Executed leaders became eternal inspirations, and their names were remembered with honor by the surviving communities. Leave a like if you see how the Christian faith was strengthened even in the most violent times. Although painful, the years of Valerian prepared the ground for more profound changes, which would follow transformations in the power structures of the Roman Empire. Finally, we come to the era of Diocletian, the most ruthless period of persecution, which ironically preceded the great victory of Christianity, the conquest of religious freedom. Diocletian and the most violent persecution. The great persecution under Diocletian was the height of intolerance. Edicts were issued ordering the destruction of Christian places of worship, the handing over of the scriptures, and the performance of obligatory sacrifices to the gods of the state. Those who refused were brutally punished. The intention was to eradicate the Christian faith once and for all, which was now seen as an irreconcilable threat to the heart of the empire. However, this attempt to annihilate Christianity not only failed, but fomented even stronger internal resistance. When Diocletian abdicated and the empire restructured, new rulers such as Constantine emerged with a different vision. The signing of the Edict of Milan in 313 BC brought religious freedom and allowed Christianity to flourish openly, moving from being the faith of the persecuted to becoming a respected and later official religion. This historical turning point shows the strength of a belief that has survived centuries of repression. Amazing, isn't it? Comment below on what struck you most about this intense journey. Throughout these centuries, Christians proved that their faith was tougher than the steel of Roman swords. They persisted, grew and won religious freedom in an empire that had previously tried to silence them. Today, as we remember these stories, we reflect on the human capacity to maintain convictions even in the face of death, and how justice and tolerance can emerge after long periods of darkness. If you enjoyed this trip back in time and want to know more incredible stories, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and share this video with your friends. This helps us grow and bring you more content like this. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next story about the Roman Empire.